there exists a night that never truly ends in the memory of Celtic peoples. It is a night without specific date or location, yet it haunts the collective consciousness of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales as if it happened to every family, in every generation, at every turn of a restless season. This is the night when a cradle falls silent, not the peaceful silence of sleep, but something far more sinister. The silence that follows when a mother realizes the child breathing in her arms is not quite the child she held before the darkness fell. Imagine yourself in the heart of a remote Irish countryside during the 1800s, or perhaps centuries before that. The veil between our world and something else has grown dangerously thin. The season turns toward winter, and with it comes an ancient hunger that feeds on human warmth, human vitality, and human love. Families bolt their doors with iron and ash, yet they know these precautions are merely gestures of defiance against forces far older than Christian prayer or modern reason. The good folk walk abroad on certain nights, moving between their hidden realm and ours with purposes we cannot fathom, driven by desires we dare not imagine. They come seeking something precious, something irreplaceable, and they will take it by force or cunning if necessary. The creature you fear is not born, but stolen. It begins as anticipation in your bones, as your instincts scream warnings. Your rational mind cannot explain. You feel watched during the dark hours. The livestock grows restless without apparent cause. Cats refuse to enter certain rooms. Even the air itself seems to hold its breath, thick with presence and intention. The good folk have marked your child, and when midnight comes, when the boundary between worlds grows gossamer thin, they make their move with the inevitability of tide following moon. What emerges from that theft is something wearing the familiar shape of your beloved. The changeling appears almost identical, occupying the same body, crying with a child's voice. Yet something fundamental has been inverted. The parents know. They always know. A mother's instinct, primal and unerring, recognizes that the creature in the crib is not the being she carried within her flesh and brought into this world through agony and love. The eyes are too ancient, too knowing, harboring centuries of alien intelligence behind infant features. The movements are subtly wrong, too precise, too considered, lacking the chaotic grace of human childhood. When it cries, the sound carries an emotional flatness that no human infant should possess. This is the heart of the terror that gripped Celtic communities. Not merely that creatures existed to steal children, but that they could do so perfectly enough that proof was nearly impossible. A mother might nurse what appeared to be her own flesh and blood, while knowing with absolute certainty that it was something else entirely. The changeling would eat voraciously, consuming food like nothing could ever satisfy its appetite, growing pale and weak despite endless provisions. It would shriek with inexplicable rage, displaying strength that no child should possess. Weeks would pass without the creature developing as children naturally do, its body remaining strangely static, almost suspended in time. For generations, families lived with this shadow hanging over their most precious moments. The birth of a child, traditionally a cause for celebration, became fraught with anxiety. New mothers found themselves studying their infants obsessively, searching for signs of wrongness, wondering constantly if the creature they held was truly their own. Every unusual behavior, every feeding difficulty, every developmental delay whispered the terrible possibility. Perhaps the fairies came in the night and took what was mine. The emotional landscape of parenthood became poisoned with doubt and existential dread. Before we continue deeper into this darkness, I want to invite you to join us on this complete journey through the mythology, the history, and the haunting reality beneath the folklore. If you haven't already, subscribe to Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the forgotten stories and ancient fears that shape the cultures we've inherited. Press that subscription button now and make sure notifications are enabled so you don't miss any of our explorations into the threshold between the seen and unseen worlds. Now, I'm genuinely curious about something. As we venture into this territory together, I'd like to know. Drop a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? What drew you to this particular story? Are you from a Celtic heritage yourself? Or is it simply the mystery of ancient folklore that called you here? Your perspective matters, and this channel thrives when we connect as a community exploring these mysteries together. Take a moment to share, and I'll be reading through those comments as we build this narrative. The Changeling myth represents far more than supernatural horror. It is an expression of primal human fears about identity, parenthood, illness, and the incomprehensible. It emerges from a time when medical science could not explain why children sometimes fail to thrive, why some infants displayed behaviors that seemed alien or disturbing, why developmental differences appeared without warning or reason. In the absence of modern medical understanding, folklore provided both explanation and framework, a structured way to make sense of the senseless. The creatures themselves became metaphors for everything that could go wrong, everything that could break the sacred bond between parent and child. Yet this is not merely a story about superstition or primitive fear. The Changeling myth persists because it touches something true at the deepest level of human experience. It articulates the terror of replacement, the fear that what we love most could be taken from us and replaced with something wearing the same skin. It speaks to the uncertainty that sometimes accompanies motherhood and fatherhood, those moments when we question whether we truly know the beings we created. It acknowledges the possibility that darkness exists, that intelligence alien to our own moves through the world, seeking what is ours, and that protection against such forces may always remain incomplete. Between one world and another exists a space that is neither. It is not fully of our realm, yet it is not entirely of theirs. This threshold, this gossamer boundary, where the fabric of reality grows thin and permeable, is where the danger truly lives. The Celtic peoples understood this with a certainty that modern minds have largely forgotten. They knew that certain places, certain times, and certain conditions could create temporary doorways, moments when the barriers separating our existence from the fair folk's domain became as fragile as the membrane of a soap bubble. Imagine standing at the edge of an Irish bog at twilight, when the sun has abandoned the sky, but darkness has not yet fully claimed it. This is neither day nor night, but something suspended between them. The ground beneath your feet is neither fully earth nor water, but a treacherous combination of both, solid and unstable simultaneously. The mist rises from the wetland in tendrils that seem almost sentient, obscuring what lies ahead, while suggesting movements just beyond perception. Locals avoid such places after dark, not from rational fear, but from something deeper, something encoded in their bones across generations. They understand instinctively that liminal spaces are where the rules of our world lose their authority. These thresholds existed everywhere in the Celtic landscape. Standing stones marked them. Ancient monuments placed precisely at locations where the veil had been observed to thin. Crossroads were particularly dangerous, the intersection of paths representing a crossing point between territories, between the mundane and the mystical. Water represented another such boundary, particularly rivers and streams where the element itself was neither solid nor fully air, where passage from one bank to another required a symbolic crossing. Forests at their edges, where civilization ended and wilderness began, held their own terrible potency. Caves and hollow hills were perhaps most dangerous of all, for in these places, one could literally enter the womb of the earth, moving downward into territories where the fair folk held dominion. But location alone was not sufficient to render children vulnerable. Time held equal significance in determining when the veil grew dangerously permeable. Samhain, the festival marking the end of summer and the beginning of the Celtic New Year, was the most fearsome of all such times. For 3 nights surrounding the 1st of November, the boundary between the living and the dead, the human and the fae, became almost negotiable. Beltane held its own power, marking the summer beginning. Another hinge upon which the doors between worlds swung wide. At Imbolc and Lugnasad, smaller festivals in the wheel of the year, the danger persisted, though somewhat diminished. But even within ordinary time, certain hours carried heightened peril. The deep midnight, that hour when day bleeds into the next, when most humans sleep and the traffic between worlds intensifies. The fair folk were not constrained by our calendar or our understanding of time's progression. They operated according to principles fundamentally alien to human rhythm and reason. Yet, they had learned to exploit the moments when human consciousness grew thin, when our world's defenses lowered naturally. Darkness held power for them that daylight diminished. During sleep, when the conscious mind released its grip on reality, children were especially vulnerable. The pregnant woman, at the moment of birth, hovering between one identity and another, was marked as prey. The newly dead, still lingering in the liminal space between life and the afterworld, attracted fae attention like moths to flame. Christmas presented particular danger despite the later layers of Christian tradition overlaying Celtic belief. The 12 nights of winter celebration had always been sacred time in Celtic culture, a period when the year lay suspended between the old and the new, when normal laws seemed momentarily suspended. Midwinter itself, the solstice when darkness reigned supreme and the sun's return remained uncertain, was a threshold night of immense power. Even the first 3 days of any month carried slight but measurable increased risk, when the lunar cycle had just turned and fresh moons emerged to replace the old. Families understood these patterns with the kind of knowledge that doesn't require formal documentation or external validation. Mothers kept their children closest to home during the dangerous seasons. Extra precautions were taken during the vulnerable hours. Iron, that most deadly of substances to the fair folk, was positioned near sleeping infants during nights of particular peril. Holy water and sacred plants were gathered and dried, ready for deployment when the calendar turned toward dangerous times. Prayers were learned not as quaint traditions, but as essential protective practices, incantations meant to reinforce the barrier between worlds. Yet, for all these precautions, vulnerability remained absolute. The fair folk possessed knowledge and abilities that human families could never fully match. They understood the terrain where 2 worlds met more intimately than any human could. They knew which farmhouses sat too close to hidden fairy forts, which children carried the genetic markers that made them especially desirable. Some families had reputations extending generations. The changelings ran in their bloodlines, it was said, as if the creatures developed a taste for particular bloodstock and returned generation after generation to harvest it. The concept of the threshold extended beyond the merely physical or temporal. Emotional states could also create vulnerabilities. A mother experiencing deep grief or postpartum sorrow was said to be dangerously thin, barely present in her own body. Her attention divided between this world and whatever internal landscape her suffering had opened within her. Children born prematurely, or with visible difference or unusual characteristics, were viewed with a mixture of concern and protective vigilance. Perhaps they were already partially marked by the fair folk, already halfway between worlds. What unified all these thresholds, all these dangerous moments and places and states of being, was the common principle of instability. Anything that represented transition, ambiguity, or incompleteness could become a portal through which the fair folk reached into our realm. The Celtic understanding of reality included acceptance that boundaries were permeable, that safety was always conditional, and that the forces shaping existence operated according to rules utterly indifferent to human welfare. The threshold between worlds was not a metaphor, but a literal geography of danger, charted by tradition and reinforced by fear born from actual, documented tragedies. To understand why the fair folk stole human children, one must first abandon the comfort of moral categories and enter a realm where motivations operate according to entirely foreign logic. The creatures of the Celtic otherworld were not demons driven by malevolence for its own sake, nor were they acting from simple hunger or territorial impulse. Their reasons were far more complex, rooted in their own existence, their own limitations, and their relationship to the human world they occasionally invaded. They took our children because something within themselves was breaking, weakening, fading, and human vitality offered the only remedy they understood. The fairy folk, according to Celtic tradition, inhabited a realm parallel to ours, but fundamentally diminished in certain essential ways. Their world was beautiful beyond human comprehension, but it was also sterile. Nothing died there, which meant nothing was truly born either. Existence perpetuated itself in endless, unchanging cycles. The seasons followed no natural progression. There was no genuine death, no renewal, no transformation arising from decay and rebirth. This stasis, though it might seem like eternal paradise to human minds shaped by mortality and loss, represented a profound curse to creatures who understood existence as a process of constant becoming. Over the centuries and millennia of their captivity in this unchanging realm, something in the fairy bloodline itself began to weaken. They observed humanity with a hunger that went beyond mere curiosity. Human children possessed something the fair folk had lost or never fully developed, a capacity for genuine growth, authentic emotion unbounded by the crystalline perfection of their otherworldly realm. Children grew, changed, died eventually, and in that mortality lay a vitality that fairy nature could never access independently. A human infant represented pure potential, raw life force uncontaminated by the centuries of stasis that had drained fairy existence of its urgency and authenticity. This was not malice motivating the theft, but desperation disguised as predation. The fairy folk comprehended an ancient truth that human folklore only dimly grasped. Bloodlines were currency in the supernatural economy. A fairy that bore half-human offspring would produce children with hybrid vigor, creatures who might possess the immortal nature of their fey parent while retaining the capacity for genuine growth and change that characterized humanity. These hybrid children would be stronger, more resilient, more adaptable than purely fey creatures. They would carry in their blood the solution to the weakening that plagued fairy society. From this perspective, the changelings left behind were not cruel mockeries, but carefully calculated biological exchanges. The fairy folk hoped to infuse their own failing lineages with human vitality, while providing a substitute that, however imperfect, resembled the stolen child, closely enough to avoid immediate suspicion. Some versions of the folklore suggest an even more terrible motivation. Certain accounts indicate that the fair folk needed human children specifically because they could not bear their own young. Fairy women, according to these traditions, were sterile or produced only stillborn offspring. A human child, taken and ritually absorbed into fairy society through specific ceremonies, could be transformed into a fey being while retaining the capacity for growth and development that pure fairy nature lacked. The stolen human child became, in a sense, a sort of immortal foster child, trapped between worlds, neither fully fey nor completely human, but transformed into something uniquely horrifying, a bridge between realms, forever altered. The motivations also revealed something about the relationship between the fair folk and humanity. We were not merely victims to them, but resources, specifically repositories of something they desperately needed, but no longer possessed. This reframing complicates the moral landscape considerably. The fairy folk were not acting from simple evil, but from a kind of supernatural desperation, an acknowledgement that their realm, for all its immortal beauty, was a dead end without the infusion of human blood and human potential. They had become vampiric in a metaphorical sense, dependent on what humanity alone could provide. There existed also the matter of insult and cosmic debt. Celtic tradition held that the fair folk maintained elaborate codes of honor, obligation, and reciprocal exchange. To take a human child without offering something in return was a profound violation of these supernatural laws. Yet the changelings represented, in their twisted logic, a form of exchange. Even if humans rejected the exchange, even if parents found the substitute revolting and unbearable, the act of leaving a changeling was the fair folk's way of attempting to balance cosmic scales, however inadequately, however much their victims despised the bargain. Some traditions suggested that the fair folk genuinely believed human parents would accept the exchange, or might not even notice it. This reveals a profound disconnect between their understanding and reality, suggesting that to creatures so alien, so separated from human emotion and attachment, the concept of a mother's love might be almost incomprehensible. They could calculate genetic value, could understand bloodline chemistry and supernatural advantage, but they could not fully grasp the visceral, irrational devotion that bound parent to child. From their perspective, a fair-sized substitute that could be cared for and eventually returned to their world seemed like a reasonable transaction. The changelings themselves occupied a complex moral space in this economy. Were they prisoners, sacrifices, investments? The folklore remained deliberately ambiguous. Some accounts suggested the changelings were fey creatures who had volunteered for the exchange. Tragic beings from the other world who agreed to live limited human lives in exchange for the stolen human children who would be brought to their realm and transformed. Others implied the changelings were something far darker, creatures created specifically for deception, hollow things with just enough vitality to maintain the illusion of humanness while serving as placeholders in the human family unit. What united all these motivations was an essential truth about the supernatural economy of Celtic belief. Nothing was taken without reason. Nothing was stolen purely for malice. Every abduction represented a transaction in a marketplace of cosmic power and biological necessity. The fair folk wanted our children not from hatred, but from hunger, not from cruelty, but from weakness wearing the mask of predation. Understanding this motivation, that they took what was ours because they needed what only we possessed, made the horror paradoxically more comprehensible while remaining utterly unforgivable. A mother knows her child. This knowledge runs deeper than words, deeper than conscious thought. It is encoded in her body, in the way her nervous system recognizes the specific vibration of her child's cry, the precise rhythm of their breathing, the particular way they settle against her chest. When a changeling arrives in place of her stolen infant, every instinct she possesses screams wrongness. The signs begin immediately, subtle at first, then increasingly undeniable, accumulating into a pattern that transforms suspicion into horrified certainty. These markers became the diagnostic criteria of changeling identification, passed down through generations of mothers who faced the unbearable reality that something alien inhabited their child's body. The eyes were always the first sign, the most unsettling and difficult to deny. When a mother looked into the eyes of a changeling, she encountered something that should not exist in an infant's face. Ancient intelligence, centuries of accumulated knowledge, a consciousness that operated according to completely foreign principles. These were not the unfocused, gradually brightening eyes of a human newborn discovering the world for the first time. Changeling eyes held awareness, calculation, and a peculiar emptiness simultaneously. They would fix on objects with unnatural intensity or drift across the room as if perceiving dimensions invisible to human sight. Some accounts describe eyes that seemed too large, too knowing, holding depths that made observers profoundly uncomfortable. A mother feeding a changeling would sometimes catch it staring at her with an expression of detached assessment, as if she were a fascinating but ultimately insignificant specimen worthy of clinical observation. The appetite of a changeling was legendary and seemingly insatiable. Where a human infant would nurse at regular intervals and gradually begin to accept solid foods, a changeling ate with desperate voracity that shocked and terrified families. These creatures consumed vast quantities of milk, porridge, bread, meat, anything placed before them, often with a speed and desperation that suggested primal hunger rather than childhood appetite. The food would disappear into the changeling's body, yet the creature would remain pale, weak, and underdeveloped, as if the nourishment provided no genuine sustenance. It was as though the changeling fed on something beyond mere physical nutrition, seeking satisfaction in quantities of food that would have poisoned a human child. Families would watch in horror as weeks passed with the creature eating enough for 3 children while remaining skeletal and failing to grow. The lack of growth itself became one of the most definitive signs of changeling substitution. Weeks would pass, then months, and the creature would remain precisely the size and developmental stage it had appeared to be on the night of replacement. Human children developed with astonishing rapidity. They grew visibly from week to week, their features changing, their coordination improving, their awareness expanding. A changeling would resist this natural progression with an almost deliberate stubbornness. An infant that should have begun rolling over, then sitting, then crawling, would remain motionless for months, locked in an unchanging state. When growth did occur, it happened in disturbing ways. Sudden spurts that appeared overnight, or grotesque deformations where limbs seemed to lengthen unevenly, or features to shift into inhuman proportions. Some accounts describe changelings that aged rapidly in certain ways, while remaining infantile in others, creating bodies that were fundamentally wrong in their proportions and development. The behavior of a changeling violated every expected pattern of human childhood. Where a human infant would gradually develop emotional connection to caregivers, a changeling maintained a profound disconnection, treating its foster family with indifference or active hostility. It would not cuddle, did not crave comfort, displayed no apparent joy at reunions after separation. When it cried, which it did frequently and with disturbing intensity, the sound lacked the quality of genuine distress. It was more like the sound of a creature testing its vocal apparatus, exploring what noises might provoke a response from the humans around it. Some changelings would shriek with inexplicable rage, their fury seeming disproportionate to any apparent cause. their tantrums displaying a malevolence that no human child should possess. Others would remain unnaturally silent for hours, staring into space with an expression of brooding concentration that was deeply unsettling in an infant's face. The physical strength of a changeling frequently exceeded what any child of its apparent age should possess. Mothers would struggle to hold these creatures, finding them surprisingly muscular and resistant, capable of thrashing with force that seemed impossible from a small body. During tantrums, changelings might destroy objects with intentional violence or display coordination that human infants could not yet manage. Some accounts describe changelings that crawled with an unsettling speed and precision, or gripped objects with strength that suggested adult power compressed into a child's form. This strength seemed to correlate inversely with the creature's apparent physical development. The more underdeveloped and weak-looking the changeling appeared, the more disturbingly strong it actually was when provoked or angry. The sensory sensitivities of changelings were particularly notable and diagnostic. They would shriek at sounds that human children barely noticed, yet remain indifferent to loud noises that should have startled them. Strong smells, particularly those with spiritual or religious significance, holy water, blessed herbs, iron implements, would provoke extreme reactions. The creatures seemed to experience the physical world through a filter utterly alien to human perception, responding with disproportionate intensity to stimuli that suggested the boundary between their realm and ours. Some changelings would refuse to cross running water or would become distressed in proximity to iron, as if these barriers to their own world triggered primal panic within them. These signs accumulated, each one independently disturbing, but together creating an irrefutable pattern. A mother confronted with multiple such markers could no longer rationalize them as merely unusual development or peculiar personality. The changeling revealed itself through consistent violation of every expectation surrounding childhood development and human behavior. What made these signs so terrible was their specificity. They could not be easily dismissed or explained away through normal variations in development or temperament. They pointed instead to a fundamental wrongness, an indication that the being occupying the child's body was not human, was not of this world, and was not going to develop according to the patterns that made sense to human understanding. Once a mother recognized these signs, the horror of her situation became absolute and inescapable. Human development unfolds according to invisible blueprints written into our genetic code, orchestrated by processes so intricate and coordinated that they seem almost miraculous. An infant transforms rapidly into a toddler, a child, an adolescent, each stage marked by predictable physical changes that parents anticipate and document. Weight increases steadily, bones lengthen and strengthen, muscles develop power and control. The brain expands and reorganizes itself. This process is relentless, automatic, and fundamentally rooted in the human biological imperative to grow, to mature, to eventually achieve reproductive capacity and independence. A changeling, however, resists this natural progression with what can only be described as deliberate obstinacy, as if the laws of human development held no power over its alien form. Families quickly learn to measure the changeling against other children of known age, watching with increasing horror as weeks turned into months while the creature remained suspended in its initial stage of development. Where a normal infant would double or triple in weight during the first year, a changeling might gain nothing or might gain weight in uneven, disturbing ways that suggested growth patterns utterly alien to human biology. The proportions would remain wrong: a head too large relative to the body, limbs that seemed subtly off, a physique that appeared perpetually underdeveloped regardless of how much the creature consumed. Neighbors visiting the house would comment with false cheerfulness about how the child was not growing, their words carrying barely concealed anxiety. Their eyes searching the parents' faces for confirmation of what they had begun to suspect. The months of stagnation transformed into years for many families, creating situations of profound psychological torture. A changeling might remain locked at the apparent age of 6 months, 8 months, 1 year, never advancing, never changing, never becoming what a child should become. The body would resist every effort at external development, as if whatever animated it was deliberately preventing the kind of transformation that would indicate successful integration into human existence. Some accounts describe changelings that remained essentially identical for 5, 7, even 10 years before parents, driven to desperation by years of futility, attempted the dangerous rituals meant to force the fairies to return what was taken. Other families eventually accepted the changeling as a permanent fixture of their household, a strange, unchanging presence that aged differently than it should, developing neither normally nor rapidly, but according to patterns that made no sense to human observers. When growth did occur, it manifested in disturbing and often grotesque ways. A changeling might suddenly increase in height overnight, as if some invisible force had stretched its frame, or it would develop unexpected strength that seemed completely disconnected from its apparent physical development. Some changelings aged parts of their body at different rates. The face might appear increasingly ancient and weathered, while the body remained small and childlike, creating a deeply unsettling visual disconnect. The skin texture might change unpredictably, becoming rough or scaled, or developing a peculiar translucence that suggested something not quite alive beneath the surface. Hair might grow in unusual patterns or change color dramatically, or develop an unnatural sheen that caught light in ways human hair never could. The bones of a changeling seem to develop according to entirely different mechanical principles than human skeletal structure. Observers reported that certain changelings appeared disproportionately fragile, their bones seeming brittle despite their demonstrated strength, or conversely, possessed of a density and hardness that suggested something far more mineral than organic. Some descriptions indicate spinal columns that curved in unnatural ways, or joints that bent at angles that would have been impossible for human physiology. As years passed, these structural peculiarities could become increasingly pronounced, creating bodies that were fundamentally twisted, that moved with an unsettling fluidity that suggested joints and articulation points that human anatomy did not possess. The teeth of a changeling provided particularly diagnostic information about its alien nature. Human children develop deciduous teeth according to predictable schedules, then lose them as permanent teeth emerge. A changeling might arrive with teeth already present and fully developed, as if it had been constructed with an adult's dentition crammed into an infant's mouth. Other changelings cut teeth at utterly wrong ages, or grew teeth only after years had passed, or developed teeth in patterns that violated every orthodontic principle. Some accounts describe changelings with teeth that were subtly wrong in shape or texture, or that seemed to harden and become more fang-like as time progressed. The mouths of changelings often seemed too large for their faces, capable of opening to inhuman widths when they screamed their awful cries. The fingernails and toenails of changelings frequently displayed peculiar characteristics that betrayed their supernatural origin. Rather than growing soft and flexible like human nails, they might develop hard and chitinous qualities, or grow in curved patterns that suggested something other than mammalian development. Some changelings possessed nails that appeared almost translucent, or that darkened in ways suggesting metallic content. The rate of growth for these appendages might be dramatically accelerated, or might cease entirely, creating situations where a changeling retained infant-sized nails for years, or possess nails that grew so rapidly that they required constant trimming to prevent them from curling and creating wounds. The skin itself would often reveal the fundamental wrongness of the changeling. Rather than the smooth softness of human infant skin, or the gradually changing texture of normal childhood development, a changeling might retain skin that felt peculiarly cool to touch, or that lacked proper elasticity and tone. Some accounts describe skin that seemed to have a faint luminescence, or that reflected light in ways that suggested subtle iridescence. The texture might become gradually tougher and more resistant to abrasion, or might develop patches of unusual coloration that did not match natural human variation. Rashes might appear and persist without explanation, or the skin might display unusual sensitivity to water, sunlight, or temperature variation. Perhaps most terrible of all were the cases where the changeling's body seemed to age in the reverse direction, where a creature that had arrived appearing to be an infant gradually became smaller, more wizened, more ancient-looking, as if it were being drawn back toward its true age in the Fae realm. These creatures would shrivel and diminish over years, becoming increasingly skeletal and bird-like, their skin taking on a papery quality, while their minds seemed to sharpen and become more knowing. Parents would witness their homes gradually being occupied by something that looked increasingly less like their stolen child, and increasingly more like something caught between multiple forms of existence, never quite settling into any single state of being. Desperation transforms ordinary people into something harder, more willing to cross boundaries they would never normally approach. When a family became convinced that the creature in their home was a changeling, when all the signs accumulated into overwhelming certainty, they faced a terrible choice. They could accept the situation and live with a being that was not their child, surrendering to an existence of perpetual heartbreak and alienation. Or they could act, undertaking tests and rituals designed to prove what they already knew and, theoretically, force the fairies into returning what had been taken. These tests ranged from harmless to brutally dangerous, from methods that seemed almost quaint in their logic, to procedures that constitute outright cruelty when viewed through modern ethical frameworks. Yet to the people performing them, these tests represented hope, a final desperate gambit to recover what had been stolen. The logic underlying the various tests stemmed from a fundamental principle. The changeling was not human, and therefore could not sustain itself using human methods or environments. If subjected to conditions that would harm a human child, or that triggered supernatural responses, the changeling would either be injured in ways that revealed its true nature, or would be forced to abandon its disguise. The tests exploited the assumed incompatibility between Fae nature and human existence, attempting to create situations where the creature would be forced to choose between maintaining its masquerade and preserving itself according to its true nature. From a certain logical standpoint, the tests made sense. The problem, of course, was that they frequently failed, and in failing they caused suffering to whatever being occupied the cradle. One of the most commonly documented tests involved fire. A changeling would be held close to a flame or placed near a roaring hearth, with the theory being that the creature, born of Fae essence, would recoil from human fire or would reveal its true nature when exposed to heat. Some variants suggested that a changeling would laugh with unnatural joy at being burned, finding pleasure in pain that should have caused distress. Others held that the creature would spontaneously confess or transform when exposed to adequate heat. The logic seemed sound to desperate parents. Apply controlled fire, observe the reaction, draw conclusions about the creature's nature. What actually transpired was often far more ambiguous. Some changelings did display unusual reactions to heat, while others seemed indifferent or even attracted to warmth. The test proved nothing definitively, yet it could leave the creature, or the potential human child, with serious burns that suggested either confirmation of supernatural nature or evidence of parental abuse. Water presented another avenue for testing, based on similar assumptions about Fae vulnerability. Some traditions held that a changeling could not be reflected in water, or would refuse to cross running water, or would display panic when submerged. Tests involving immersion varied wildly in their severity. Gentler versions involved simply observing the creature's reaction to water. Did it scream with primal fear, or did it splash playfully? More aggressive versions involved forced submersion, holding the changeling beneath the surface with the stated intention of forcing it to return or to reveal its true nature through supernatural response. The theory held that the creature, being Fae and therefore ultimately alien to water, would either transform or would compel its parents to stop through sudden revelation of its supernatural power. What actually occurred was often simply that a child, whether human or something else, was nearly drowned while adults watched for signs that might confirm their suspicions. Other tests relied on sensory disruption and disorientation. A changeling might be taken to a crossroads at midnight, or placed at a threshold between inside and outside, or held up to a mirror in darkness, with the assumption being that these liminal situations would trigger supernatural reactions. The creature would be observed intensely, searching for any sign that it was experiencing profound distress or experiencing perceptual phenomena that humans should not experience. Some tests involved loud noises meant to provoke particular reactions, or the application of bitter substances to the tongue to observe whether the creature would taste them as humans do. The underlying principle remained consistent. Find the conditions to which a Fae being would respond abnormally, create those conditions, and observe the results. Perhaps most revealing of the desperation motivating these tests were the methods involving trickery and social pressure. A changeling might be threatened with abandonment or injury, with the theory being that the creature would suddenly reveal its concern for its Fae family and would either confess or would magically compel its mother and father to stop. Stories circulated of changelings who, threatened with genuine danger, would suddenly speak in adult voices or would cry out in Fae language, summoning their true families. Some accounts describe parents publicly shaming or threatening the changeling before witnesses, with the expectation that supernatural forces would intervene to protect one of their own kind. This form of test operated on a different principle than the physical ones. It assumed that social pressure and genuine threat would destabilize the changeling's control over its disguise sufficiently to reveal what lay beneath. The most extreme tests crossed into territory that can only be described as intentional harm. Some regions developed traditions of specific torture-adjacent procedures meant to prove changeling identity. A creature might be held above heat long enough to cause pain and panic, then suddenly removed, with the assumption being that a Fae being would laugh or show unusual resilience, while a human child would cry authentically and require comforting. Others involve placing the changeling in circumstances of genuine danger, near precipices, in cold water, in smoke, to see whether it would display supernatural survival mechanisms or would call out in ways that summoned Fae assistance. These tests occasionally resulted in death or serious injury, yet communities engaged in them because the alternative, accepting that the wrong child occupied the cradle, was psychologically unbearable. What made these tests particularly tragic was their fundamental unreliability. A changeling that was intelligent enough to pass as human for months or years might certainly be intelligent enough to respond predictably to fire or water or threat. A human child displaying neurological differences, developmental delays, or behavioral peculiarities might react to these tests in ways that seem to confirm changeling status. The tests existed in a space of profound epistemological uncertainty, where proof was impossible, yet action seemed necessary. Parents tormented by the conviction that something was wrong would apply these tests repeatedly, trying different combinations, escalating severity, seeking the definitive evidence that would either confirm their worst fears or provide the justification for the rituals that might force the fairy folk to return their true child. These tests, born from love and desperation, frequently served only to harm the being in their care, while providing the illusory confirmation of what parents desperately wanted to believe. Prevention, understood by Celtic peoples as a sacred practice requiring constant vigilance and ritual precision, was considered far superior to the desperate interventions required once a changeling had taken the place of a stolen child. Families lived with the knowledge that the threshold between protection and catastrophe was disturbingly thin, that a single moment of carelessness, a window left open during the dangerous hours, a child left unattended during Samhain, a failure to renew protective charms, could result in the loss of what was most precious. The accumulated wisdom of generations manifested in specific objects, words, and practices that formed an intricate barrier against Fey incursion. These protections were not casual superstitions, but rather essential survival strategies, as fundamental to Celtic household management as food storage or fire maintenance. Iron occupied a position of paramount importance in the defensive arsenal against the fair folk. This metal, common enough in human hands, yet utterly toxic to Fey nature, became almost sacred in its protective capacity. Iron horseshoes were positioned above doorways and window frames, not as decorations barfan sachin say, known as signs sanctation, but as active magical barriers. Iron nails were driven into the lintels of cradles, creating a perimeter of hostile metal around the sleeping infant. Families would keep iron tools near beds where children slept, or would position iron implements at the boundaries of domestic space where Fey intrusion seemed most likely. The metal itself was believed to work passively, its very presence repelling creatures of the otherworld who could not tolerate its vibration or essence. A mother might keep an iron knife beneath the mattress of an infant's cradle, a constant guardian against supernatural theft occurring in the darkness overhead. The selection and placement of iron items followed specific logic rooted in centuries of accumulated practice. Horseshoes maintained their potency because they bore the mark of human craft and equine connection, bridging earthly and practical domains. Iron nails possess power through their use in construction, their role in binding human-made structures together. Old iron that had been worked and used by human hands over years or generations, carried more concentrated protective capacity than newly forged iron. Some families maintained specific iron implements that had belonged to their ancestors, treating these objects as heirlooms whose protective authority had been reinforced through continued use and familial association. To touch these iron items was to encounter something hostile to Fey existence, a material reminder that human spaces, despite their vulnerability to supernatural incursion, possessed defenses that the fairfolk must respect or circumvent. Salt, another substance toxic to Fey nature, complemented iron's protective functions. Families would create lines of salt at thresholds, particularly at the boundary between inside and outside, where vulnerability seemed greatest. Salt would be sprinkled around the perimeter of a sleeping child's space, creating a physical barrier that the fair folk could not cross without acknowledging their transgression. The salt line had to be continuous, unbroken, a perfect seal that no gap or weakness could compromise. If a salt line showed any disturbance or discontinuity, it lost its potency and required immediate renewal. Some families would create elaborate salt patterns around cradles, geometric designs meant to confuse or deflect Fae consciousness. The substance itself was understood to burn Fae flesh, or at minimum to create a sensation so unpleasant that creatures would avoid crossing it whenever alternative routes existed. The creation of protective salt barriers required ritual precision and timing. A mother might draw salt lines each evening as darkness fell, refreshing protections before the hours of greatest danger. During particularly vulnerable times, Samhain, Beltane, or when a child had recently displayed signs of Fae interest, salt would be applied with increased frequency and more elaborate patterns. Some traditions suggested that salt harvested from particular locations held enhanced potency, or that salt that had been blessed by religious authorities carried more concentrated defensive power. Families would sometimes combine salt with other protective substances, creating compound barriers of extraordinary complexity. A line of salt mixed with ash from a sacred fire, or salt combined with iron filings, created defenses understood to be more effective than either substance alone. Sacred words represented the final element of the protective trinity. Iron and salt providing physical and mystical barriers, while words of power created a spiritual perimeter around the vulnerable child. Prayers, incantations, and Christian liturgy were deployed strategically to strengthen defenses against creatures that predated Christianity, yet seemed to respect its authority. A mother would recite specific prayers over her sleeping child, words intended to create an auditory barrier as effective as iron or salt in deflecting supernatural attention. These prayers were often combined with physical gestures, signs of the cross traced over the cradle, or specific hand movements meant to strengthen spiritual fortification. The words themselves mattered less than the intention and authority with which they were spoken, as if language itself could become a weapon against Fae intrusion when wielded with sufficient faith and conviction. The rhythm and repetition of protective incantations were crucial to their effectiveness. A mother might repeat a prayer hundreds of times during vulnerable hours, establishing a kind of sonic protection through accumulation and persistence. The words created a psychological state of vigilant defense while simultaneously establishing what was believed to be an actual spiritual barrier. Names of saints, invocations of divine protection, and traditional prayers were deployed in combination, layered upon one another to create multiple levels of defensive coverage. Some families possessed specific words or phrases passed down through generations, understood to carry particular potency because of their age and the authority of those who had spoken them before. To speak such words was to activate a chain of protection that extended backward through time, connecting current parents to ancestors who had guarded their own children using these same formulas. The combination of all three protections, iron positioned strategically, salt applied in precise patterns, words of power spoken with conviction, created what was believed to be an essentially impenetrable defense against casual Fae predation. A home properly protected according to these principles was supposed to be substantially safer, the changeling threat reduced from certainty to mere possibility. Yet families understood that even comprehensive protection was not absolute. The truly determined Fae could potentially overcome such barriers through superior power or knowledge. A family member's lapse in vigilance, a moment of forgotten ritual, a single salt line left unrenewed could create the vulnerability through which supernatural theft might occur. Protections, therefore, required constant renewal and recommitment. Understanding that safety was maintained through perpetual practice and unfailing adherence to tradition. a burden that fell primarily upon mothers who carried the ultimate responsibility for keeping their children anchored safely to the human world. When testing and observation could no longer be endured, when the certainty of changeling presence became unbearable, families resorted to a final category of intervention: elaborate rituals designed to communicate with the fair folk directly and force them into returning the stolen child. These rituals operated on the assumption that the Fae were bound by cosmic law, that they could be negotiated with, threatened, or manipulated into honoring exchanges that no human truly wanted to make. The rituals varied considerably across regions and time periods, reflecting local variations in fairy lore and regional understandings of how supernatural creatures might be compelled to act against their desires. What united these diverse practices was a single, desperate hope: that through the right combination of words, actions, and symbolic gestures, parents could pierce the veil between worlds and reclaim what fairies had stolen. One of the most widespread ritual practices involved the purposeful abandonment of the changeling at a significant location, typically a fairy fort, a crossroads, or another liminal space believed to hold Fae attention or authority. The idea underlying this extreme act was straightforward. The changeling was useless to the humans who possessed it, and increasingly unbearable to keep. By abandoning it at a location where fairies were known to gather, parents signaled to the fair folk that the exchange was unacceptable, that they were rejecting the substitute and demanding the return of the genuine child. The ritual required careful timing, often performed during the dangerous seasons when the veil was thin, or during specific lunar phases understood to align with Fae power. The changeling would be left at the designated location, frequently with offerings meant to appease the fairies or to encourage them to complete the exchange. These abandonment rituals often included elaborate symbolic elements meant to communicate the parent's intentions and emotional state to creatures operating according to supernatural logic. A mother might leave her own most precious possession alongside the changeling, indicating her willingness to sacrifice enormously for the return of her true child. She might compose prayers or incantations meant to be discovered alongside the abandoned creature, words directed at the fairy folk, explaining the situation and demanding justice according to their own codes and laws. Some traditions prescribe that the abandonment location be marked with specific symbols or arrangements meant to catch Fae attention, stones arranged in particular patterns, or objects positioned according to elaborate geometric designs. The ritual assumed that the fair folk, possessed of alien intelligence and supernatural perception, would understand these signals and would recognize that the human family was calling upon them to honor the ancient bargains that governed interaction between worlds. Another category of ritual centered on deliberate deception, meant to trick the fairies into revealing themselves or inadvertently revealing the location of the stolen child. A family might stage an elaborate funeral for the changeling, complete with genuine mourning, the assumption being that the fairies would be unable to resist observing what they assumed was the death of their surrogate. When they appeared to mourn or to recover the changeling, they would theoretically reveal information about where the stolen child was being held. Other deceptions involved creating false abundance or false danger, spreading word that the family had come into sudden wealth, or conversely, that terrible plague had struck the household, with the hope that fairies monitoring the family would respond in predictable ways that might reveal their presence or intentions. Rituals of negotiation represented perhaps the most intellectually complex category of intervention. based on the assumption that fairies, though utterly alien, operated according to comprehensible logic and could be bargained with. A family might publicly offer exchange, proposing that they would surrender the changeling in return for the human child, creating a formal negotiation that the fair folk, bound by supernatural law and honor codes, would be compelled to acknowledge and respond to. These negotiations might occur at designated times and places, with family representatives positioning themselves at fairy forts or other known fae locations, speaking aloud their demands and offers, waiting for responses that might come through signs and portents rather than direct communication. Some families claim to have conducted actual conversations with fairies, elaborate dialogues where terms were discussed and counteroffers were made. Humans and fae creatures haggling over human destiny as if at a supernatural marketplace. The most direct interventions involved what might be termed fae kidnapping in reverse. Families would attempt to penetrate the boundaries between worlds and retrieve their children through supernatural means. These dangerous rituals sometimes involve traveling to known fairy forts or hollow hills, locations where the boundary between worlds seem particularly thin, and performing ceremonies meant to open a gateway. A mother might attempt to enter the fairy realm herself, guided by rituals and protected by charms, with the intention of locating and reclaiming her child directly. These efforts were understood to be extraordinarily perilous. A human venturing into fae territory risked becoming trapped, transformed, or corrupted by exposure to the otherworld's fundamentally alien nature. Yet, desperation occasionally overcame caution, and families would undertake these rituals despite the genuine danger involved. Certain rituals involve the intervention of individuals believed to possess particular authority or supernatural knowledge. Wise women, priests, or occasionally ordinary individuals who had themselves been marked by fae interaction, or who possessed inherited abilities to negotiate with supernatural creatures. These specialists might be brought into the home to perform elaborate ceremonies meant to compel the changeling to speak truth about its origins, or to create magical conditions under which the fairies would be forced to respond. The specialist might chant for hours, create elaborate diagrams, or symbolic arrangements meant to bind fae creatures into compliance, or perform actions designed to trigger supernatural reactions. Some accounts describe specialists who claim to communicate directly with the fairies, who would relay messages or demands from families to creatures operating according to entirely foreign principles. The rituals rarely succeeded in producing the literal return of stolen children, yet families continued to perform them because the alternative was acceptance of permanent loss and transformation. These desperate ceremonies represented a final assertion of human will against supernatural predation, an insistence that the cosmic order could be bent through sufficient faith, intention, and ritual precision. They embodied both profound grief and stubborn hope, the conviction that if only the right words could be spoken, the right actions performed at the right moment, the fairies might be compelled to acknowledge human claims and restore what had been taken. The rituals failed more often than they succeeded, yet their very performance provided psychological comfort, a sense that something was being done, that the situation remained negotiable rather than entirely lost. History occasionally offers us moments where the abstract becomes devastatingly concrete, where beliefs that exist primarily in folklore and tradition collide catastrophically with the modern world, leaving behind undeniable evidence of the consequences of supernatural conviction. The case of Bridget Cleary represents perhaps the most infamous documented instance of changeling belief manifesting in actual tragedy. On the night of March 15th in the year 1895, in the small village of Clonmel in County Tipperary, Ireland, a 26-year-old woman was burned to death by her own husband and members of her family, all acting under the conviction that she had been replaced by a changeling, and that fire was the appropriate mechanism for forcing the fairies to return the genuine Bridget. Bridget Cleary was by all accounts a woman of some independence and modern sensibility for her time. She worked as a seamstress, possessed skills and knowledge beyond what most rural women of her era accumulated, and maintained a degree of autonomy unusual for married women in 1895 Ireland. She had married Michael Cleary, a cooper by trade, approximately 2 years before the events that would make her name synonymous with Changeling tragedy. The couple lived in a cottage outside the village, maintaining a somewhat isolated existence that would prove significant as events unfolded. By early March of that year, Bridget had fallen ill. Accounts suggest influenza or possibly pneumonia, a serious but not extraordinary ailment that might have been fatal in an era without modern medical intervention, yet which would not have seemed obviously life-threatening to contemporary observers. Michael Cleary apparently became convinced that his wife's illness was not ordinary sickness, but rather a sign that she had been taken by the fairies and replaced with a changeling. The progression from reasonable concern about illness to absolute conviction of supernatural replacement occurred with disturbing rapidity, suggesting either that Bridget's condition deteriorated dramatically or that pre-existing belief systems provided a framework that made changeling explanation feel compelling. Michael consulted with a local man named Jack Dunn, who possessed a reputation as someone knowledgeable about supernatural matters and fairy lore. Dunn apparently confirmed Michael's suspicions, providing what was understood as authoritative validation that Bridget was indeed a changeling. Other family members and neighbors became involved, and what had been a private family crisis began transforming into a communal intervention. On the night of March 15th, approximately 10 to 15 people gathered at the Cleary cottage, united by conviction that Bridget was a changeling and that forceful action was necessary. The events of that night proceeded according to a logic that made perfect sense within the framework of changeling belief, yet which read as almost incomprehensible horror when viewed through modern perspective. Michael and others subjected Bridget to repeated interrogation, demanding that she confess to being a changeling and calling upon her to reveal where her true identity lay, and how the fairies might be compelled to return the genuine Bridget. When she denied being a changeling and protested the accusations, her denials were interpreted not as genuine denial, but as confirmation of the changeling's deceptive nature. A changeling would naturally deny its true identity, would cling to the human disguise, would resist confession through all possible means. The gathering attempted various interventions, including the application of heat, meant to force supernatural revelation or revelation of the true Bridget's location. Michael, driven by conviction and possibly by anger at what he interpreted as his wife's refusal to confess, held Bridget over the fire. The precise sequence of events remains somewhat disputed, but the undeniable result was that Bridget suffered severe burns. In the aftermath of this trauma, the family attempted to provide her with care, though they apparently remained convinced even then that they were treating a changeling rather than an injured human woman. Bridget died from her injuries, yet even in death, some accounts suggest that family members continued to believe she was a changeling, that the fairies would return if given proper opportunity and ritual completion. What made the Bridget Cleary case particularly significant was that it did not disappear into folklore as an isolated tragedy. The case was investigated by authorities, brought to trial, and documented extensively in legal proceedings and newspaper accounts. Michael Cleary was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, which indicated that the legal system recognized the genuine belief motivating his actions while still holding him criminally responsible. He served 15 years in prison before being released. Other family members faced lesser charges or were acquitted, yet the legal proceedings created a permanent record of changeling belief and its tragic consequences. Newspaper accounts carried the story across Ireland and beyond, shocking educated observers, with evidence that such beliefs persisted even in the final decade of the 19th century, even in a population increasingly exposed to modern education and scientific reasoning. The case revealed something crucial about the persistence of changeling belief, despite the advance of modern knowledge. Bridget Cleary died not in the deep past, not in some isolated region completely cut off from modernity, but in a relatively accessible area of Ireland, in a year when trains connected the country, when newspapers circulated, when scientific explanation for illness was increasingly available. Yet a community of apparently ordinary people, including educated individuals, could still become convinced that supernatural forces were at work and that violent intervention was justified. The tragedy suggested that changeling belief, far from being a relic of ancient ignorance, maintained surprising resilience in the modern era. Modern medical analysis of Bridget's case suggests possibilities that might have seemed perfectly mundane to contemporary medical professionals, but which fit changeling narrative perfectly when filtered through folklore belief. Influenza, pneumonia, or potentially other illnesses could have caused behavior changes, periods of delirium, apparent personality alteration, and apparent disassociation from normal family relationships, all characteristics that matched changeling presentation. A woman suffering from severe illness might indeed seem strange, alien, disconnected from ordinary human emotion and social engagement. The appearance of supernatural replacement was not inexplicable. It represented a desperate attempt to make sense of medical crisis using the cognitive frameworks available to people without access to modern medical understanding. This realization transformed Bridget Cleary's death from a simple story of ignorant savagery into something far more complex and tragic. In the 1920s and 1930s, decades after the Bridget Cleary tragedy, and well into an era when modern education and scientific reasoning had become increasingly widespread, the Irish Folklore Commission undertook an ambitious project to document the beliefs, stories, and experiences of ordinary Irish people. Collectors travelled throughout rural Ireland, recording testimonies from individuals who possessed first-hand knowledge or had inherited detailed understanding of supernatural traditions that their communities maintained. What emerged from this systematic documentation was striking evidence that changeling belief had not been eradicated by modernization, education, or the march of scientific progress. Elderly people, community elders, and individuals with reputations as keepers of traditional knowledge spoke openly and seriously about changelings, describing encounters, sharing techniques for identification and intervention, and discussing the changeling phenomenon with the kind of matter-of-fact certainty that suggested these were not fantasies, but rather documented aspects of communal experience. The testimonies recorded by the Folklore Commission revealed remarkable consistency across different regions, suggesting that changeling lore represented not scattered individual beliefs, but rather a coherent cultural tradition maintained across generations and distributed across geographic space. Witnesses described experiencing or observing situations matching the classic changeling pattern: children who failed to grow, who displayed unusual behavior, who seemed fundamentally altered from what they had been before a certain night or event. These were not vague recollections, but detailed accounts, often provided by individuals of considerable age who claimed to have observed such situations decades earlier, yet who retained vivid memories of specific characteristics, behavioral peculiarities, and the interventions attempted by families. The specificity and consistency of these accounts suggested either genuine accumulated experience with unusual developmental conditions that the communities interpreted through changeling framework, or the persistence of belief so deeply embedded in cultural consciousness that it continued to structure perception and memory even among people who possessed access to modern alternatives. One particularly striking feature of the Folklore Commission testimonies was the matter-of-fact tone with which elderly witnesses discussed their beliefs about changelings. These were not people attempting to convince skeptics or defending beliefs they recognized as outdated. Instead, they spoke as individuals sharing accepted community knowledge, the kind of information that any responsible parent should possess. A witness might describe the signs of a changeling with the same practical certainty one might employ in discussing crop rotation or animal husbandry. These were things one needed to know to function successfully within one's community and to protect what mattered most. The tone suggested that for these individuals, changeling belief represented not superstition, but rather legitimate knowledge about a genuine phenomenon that their communities had learned to recognize and manage. The testimonies documented not merely the existence of changeling belief, but also the techniques that communities employed to address suspected cases. Witnesses described protective practices that had been maintained within families for generations, specific arrangements of salt, particular iron implements positioned in precise locations, prayers or incantations spoken according to particular rhythms or at designated times. These practices were described not as magical attempts to circumvent natural law, but rather as common sense precautions, practical measures comparable to keeping a fire burning in winter or maintaining fences to protect livestock from predation. The casual way in which elderly witnesses described these practices suggested that for them, protecting children from supernatural predation was as natural and necessary as protecting them from ordinary physical danger. Particularly notable were the testimonies describing specific cases of suspected changelings within living memory of the witnesses. An elderly woman might describe a child born in her village decades earlier who had never grown, who had displayed the characteristic appetite and behavioral markers, whose family had attempted various interventions over years of futility and desperation. These personal testimonies often conveyed deep sympathy for the families involved, recognition of the genuine anguish experienced by parents convinced they had lost their children to supernatural forces. The witnesses did not present changeling cases as simple matters of parental ignorance, but rather as genuine tragedies born from the collision between human love and supernatural predation, situations where compassion and protection competed with supernatural horror. The Folklore Commission also recorded detailed accounts of interventions, including descriptions of rituals performed to recover stolen children or to prove changeling status. Some witnesses claimed personal knowledge of cases where rituals had apparently succeeded, where fairies had been compelled to return human children or had taken back their substitutes. These accounts were presented with genuine conviction, the witnesses apparently having no doubt about the reality of the outcomes they described. Others acknowledged the difficulty of proving success, recognizing that families who believed a child had been returned or who had come to terms with having a changeling in their household might be interpreting ambiguous situations through the lens of their desires and beliefs. Yet even these more cautious accounts conveyed the sense that such interventions represented legitimate attempts to address genuine supernatural threats. What made the Folklore Commission testimonies particularly valuable was their documentation of the transition period when changeling belief was gradually declining, but had not yet entirely disappeared from living practice. Some witnesses described beliefs held by their parents or grandparents that they themselves had come to doubt. yet which they acknowledged had shaped their own early understanding of children and development. Others claimed continued conviction in changeling reality, insisting that modern medicine and education had not adequately explained all the phenomena that communities had long attributed to supernatural substitution. These transitional perspectives revealed changeling belief in the process of transformation, moving from unquestioned acceptance toward increasing skepticism, yet maintaining surprising resilience even among people exposed to modern alternatives. The testimonies also revealed regional variations in changeling beliefs and practices, suggesting that while the basic framework remained consistent, local communities had developed their own specific understandings and techniques. Some regions emphasized iron as the primary protection, while others stressed salt or religious intervention. Certain areas maintained specific rituals for proving changeling status that differed from practices in neighboring communities. These variations suggested that changeling belief was not a static doctrine handed down unchanged through time, but rather a living tradition that communities adapted and modified in response to their own experiences and emerging understanding. The Folklore Commission essentially captured changeling lore in the process of natural evolution, documenting beliefs that had been shaped by generations of accumulated observation and that continued to shift and transform based on communities' ongoing interaction with the phenomenon. To be a mother is to inhabit a state of profound vulnerability that patriarchal societies have long attempted to hide beneath sentimentality and spiritual elevation. Motherhood exists in a space where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, where a woman's biology and psychology become intertwined with the existence of another being in ways that cannot be fully rationalized or explained. Yet when that being appears to be gradually revealing itself as something fundamentally alien, something not born from your flesh and love but imposed upon you through supernatural predation, motherhood transforms into a state of psychological torment, almost impossible to articulate or comprehend. A mother confronting the possibility that her child is a changeling inhabits a particular circle of emotional hell, caught between the visceral love she feels for the being in her care and the devastating certainty that this creature is not the one she birthed. The psychological state of a mother harboring suspicions of changeling replacement was one of profound and relentless ambiguity. She could not simply reject the creature, society, law, and her own sense of maternal responsibility. All demanded that she continue to provide care and nourishment, regardless of her suspicions. Yet, she could not fully accept it either, could not experience the uncomplicated love and joy that a mother should feel toward her child. Instead, she existed in a suspended state between these impossible positions, oscillating between moments of genuine affection and maternal protectiveness toward the creature in her arms, and moments of absolute conviction that she was nurturing an imposter, a hollow thing wearing her child's face. This constant oscillation between competing emotional states created a psychological environment that was essentially toxic, a perpetual state of internal contradiction that could not be resolved through any means available to her. The guilt that accompanied such suspicions was often as torturous as the suspicions themselves. A mother who began to believe her child was a changeling was forced to confront the possibility that she was capable of rejecting her own offspring, that the instinct to love and protect her child could be overwhelmed by conviction of its supernatural replacement. She would look at the creature in the cradle and would simultaneously experience overwhelming maternal protection and absolute certainty of wrongness, two incompatible responses competing for dominance in her consciousness. When she held the being she suspected was a changeling, she experienced genuine maternal instinct, the body's recognition of the creature as an infant requiring care and protection. Yet moments later, observing the strange behaviors and ancient eyes, she would be seized by conviction that she was being manipulated by a supernatural deceiver, that her maternal instincts were being weaponized against her by Fey intelligence. The isolation of a mother in this situation was nearly absolute. How could she articulate her suspicions to a husband or family members without risking judgment, without inviting the possibility that she would be perceived as mentally unstable or unfit as a mother? A woman who expressed conviction that her child was a changeling was confessing to something that the broader society was increasingly coming to view as superstition or delusion. Yet simultaneously, she was living in a cultural context where changeling belief remained legitimate, where her community might actually validate and reinforce her suspicions rather than challenging them. The isolation was thus paradoxical. She might be surrounded by people who shared her belief system, yet unable to fully communicate the specific terror and doubt that her particular situation created. The physical toll of this psychological state was substantial and often neglected in historical and folkloric accounts. A mother convinced her child was a changeling experienced chronic stress that manifested in the body, inability to sleep even when the creature slept, constant tension and hypervigilance, the physical sensation of dread that accompanied each morning's observation of the unchanging creature. Her appetite might diminish while she was simultaneously expected to nurse and sustain a changeling that consumed food voraciously. Her body would be exhausted by perpetual vigilance while her mind remained locked in obsessive analysis of the creature's behavior, searching constantly for new evidence confirming or denying changeling status. Women in this situation sometimes developed what would now be recognized as depression, anxiety disorders, or other mental health conditions, though these were understood within her cultural context as reasonable responses to genuine supernatural threat. The moral complexity of a mother's position deepened when she considered the rituals and interventions that communities suggested. To prove her child was a changeling to force the fairies into returning her genuine child, she might need to participate in or allow procedures that would harm the creature in her arms, exposure to fire, threatened drowning, abandonment in dangerous locations. Even if she believed absolutely that the creature was a changeling, participating in such rituals meant inflicting suffering on something wearing her child's face, something that called her mother and depended entirely on her protection. The mother was thus caught in an impossible ethical position where protecting what might be her genuine child seemed to demand harming the being in her current care. Some mothers, faced with this choice, refused to participate in aggressive interventions, choosing instead to endure their doubts and suspicions rather than risk harming what might, however remotely, be their actual child. The relationship between a mother and a suspected changeling was often characterized by a peculiar quality of detached functionality. A mother would continue to feed, clothe, and protect the creature with the dedication a child required, yet would do so without the warmth and spontaneous affection that normally accompanied such care. She would perform the functions of motherhood mechanically, driven by responsibility and moral obligation, rather than by the instinctive joy that typically motivated maternal care. This emotional distance, though it might have been necessary for psychological survival, often created an additional layer of guilt. A mother aware that she was not loving her child as fully as a mother should would question whether her emotional withdrawal itself was evidence of changeling status, or whether she was simply becoming a worse mother through her own inability to fully believe or commit to loving the creature. Some mothers developed elaborate fantasy narratives about the true child as a coping mechanism. They might imagine their genuine child living in fairy realm, thriving in the otherworld, perhaps eventually being returned or developing such superior existence that rescue became less ethically pressing. These fantasies allowed a mother to maintain some emotional connection to the idea of her true child, while simultaneously accepting the creature in her current care as a permanent fixture of her existence. The imagination provided a space where the impossible emotional terrain could be partially navigated, she could mourn the child she had lost while simultaneously accepting the changeling she was forced to raise. Some mothers reported eventually developing genuine affection for the changeling, despite their conviction of its supernatural origin, suggesting that proximity, obligation, and the passage of time could gradually overcome the initial horror of replacement. The possibility existed that a mother's conviction of changeling replacement was itself a symptom of postpartum mental illness, a manifestation of the desperate need to make sense of a situation that felt fundamentally wrong in ways she could not articulate or explain. A child displaying developmental delays, neurological differences, or behavioral peculiarities might trigger maternal perception of wrongness that, in absence of medical explanation, was interpreted through available cultural frameworks as fairy substitution. The mother's experience of this wrongness was genuine. Something truly was different or concerning about the child, yet the explanation she developed was shaped by cultural belief systems rather than by medical reality. In these cases, the mother's psychological torment, though rooted in misunderstanding of the actual situation, was no less real or devastating than it would have been had actual supernatural replacement occurred. The modern medical perspective on changeling folklore reveals a complex relationship between ancient belief systems and the actual developmental and neurological conditions that those beliefs were attempting to explain and contextualize. When we examine the specific characteristics attributed to changelings, developmental stagnation, unusual behavior, apparent emotional disconnection, consumption of food without corresponding growth, we encounter descriptions that align with striking accuracy to documented medical conditions that existed in Celtic populations just as they exist in populations worldwide today. The question that emerges is not whether these conditions existed, but rather how communities without medical training or scientific framework would have made sense of such phenomena, what interpretive structures would have been available to them, and whether the changeling myth represents not supernatural delusion, but rather a cultural attempt to impose comprehensible narrative on medical mystery. Failure to thrive, a syndrome in which infants and young children fail to grow at expected rates despite apparently adequate nutrition and care, represents, perhaps, the closest medical parallel to changeling presentation. A child suffering from failure to thrive would exhibit precisely the characteristics that communities interpreted as changeling markers: lack of physical growth despite consuming food, developmental delays, apparent emotional disconnection, and physical appearance that seem to violate expected progression toward maturation. Before modern medical science could identify the biological mechanisms underlying failure to thrive, nutrient absorption issues, metabolic disorders, hormonal imbalances, families experiencing such a condition would have witnessed a terrifying phenomenon. A child that ate but did not grow, that seemed trapped in an unchanging developmental state, that appeared to be something other than what human children should be. The myth of the changeling provided a framework through which this otherwise inexplicable condition could be comprehended and acted upon. Autism spectrum disorder and related neurodevelopmental conditions present another remarkable correlation with changeling characteristics. Children on the autism spectrum often display apparent emotional disconnection, reduced capacity for typical social bonding, unusual sensory responses, and behavioral patterns that neurotypical observers interpret as alien or disturbing. Historical accounts describe changelings that would not make eye contact, that lacked normal social responsiveness, that displayed intense reactions to sensory stimuli that other children barely noticed. A child with autism, particularly severe autism, might indeed appear to a pre-modern observer as fundamentally different from human children, as if the emotional, and social capacities that defined human childhood were missing or inverted. The child would be present physically, but would seem mentally elsewhere, operating according to internal logic that caregivers could not access or comprehend. To a family without any framework for understanding neurodevelopmental differences, such a child might appear to be exactly what the changeling myth described, a being wearing human form, but lacking essential human qualities. Postpartum psychosis and maternal mental illness provide another dimension to understanding changeling belief through medical lens. A mother experiencing postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, or postpartum psychosis might develop delusional thoughts about her child, conviction that the child is not genuinely hers, that something has been substituted, that the being in her care is alien or dangerous. These maternal mental health conditions are not merely modern phenomena, but rather biological realities that existed in historical populations, just as they exist today. A mother in the grip of postpartum psychosis might become absolutely convinced that her child was a changeling, might communicate this conviction to family members with sufficient intensity that others began to share her belief. What would have been interpreted as maternal intuition about supernatural replacement might have actually been symptomatic of treatable psychiatric illness. Yet without medical framework to identify and treat the condition, the belief spiral would have continued, potentially leading to harmful interventions based on psychiatric delusion rather than genuine supernatural danger. Certain chromosomal and genetic conditions present in human populations would have been completely incomprehensible to communities lacking genetic science. A child born with Down syndrome or other genetic conditions would display developmental differences, unusual physical features, and behavioral characteristics that deviated from expected patterns. Such a child might have appeared to communities as fundamentally different, as if something had been altered or replaced. The peculiar facial features, the developmental delays, the unusual behavioral patterns, all would have seemed to confirm suspicion of supernatural substitution. Yet what communities interpreted as fairy replacement was actually the visible manifestation of genetic variation, biological diversity that would eventually be understood through genetics and molecular biology, but which appeared inexplicable and profoundly wrong to observers without such knowledge. Congenital conditions affecting the nervous system, including various forms of developmental disability and neurological disorder, would have presented similarly incomprehensible phenomena to historical observers. A child with cerebral palsy, with epilepsy, with hydrocephalus, or with other neurological conditions would display movement patterns, cognitive development, and behavioral characteristics that seemed utterly alien to typical child development. The child's apparent struggle with basic functions that other children performed effortlessly, the peculiar way the body moved or the mind seemed to function, would have seemed to confirm that something fundamentally wrong had occurred, that the human child had been replaced with something operating according to completely different principles. Communities seeking explanation would have reached for the changeling framework precisely because no other framework was available that could make sense of such profound developmental difference. Malabsorption disorders and metabolic conditions represent another medical explanation for changeling presentation. Children with celiac disease, cystic fibrosis, or various inborn errors of metabolism would consume food voraciously, yet fail to grow normally, would display behavioral changes and developmental delays, would seem to be trapped in underdevelopment despite massive caloric intake. These conditions would have been utterly mysterious to pre-modern observers, creating the exact scenario that changeling mythology described. Creatures that ate impossibly large quantities yet remained weak and underdeveloped, as if the food disappeared into some supernatural void rather than nourishing the body. A child with cystic fibrosis would cough persistently and mysteriously, would fail to gain weight despite constant feeding, would seem to be wasting away despite every effort to sustain it. To desperate families, such a child would appear to be exactly what a changeling should be, something that mimicked human form but operated according to radically different biological principles. The psychological toll of undiagnosed developmental disability in historical context cannot be overstated. Parents observing their child's apparent difference from other children, watching development unfold in unexpected ways, seeing their child struggle with tasks other children perform naturally, would experience profound distress and confusion. Without medical explanation, they would grasp for any framework that made sense of what they were witnessing. Changeling belief provided such a framework. It explained why their child was different. It suggested that the situation was not permanent damnation of the parent's genetics or worth, but rather supernatural affliction. And it offered the hope that through proper rituals and interventions, the genuine child might be recovered. The myth thus served a psychological function, transforming inexplicable tragedy into a narrative structure that provided some sense of comprehensibility and potential resolution. Modern medical understanding suggests that changeling belief represents not superstitious delusion, but rather a rational attempt by pre-scientific communities to make sense of medical phenomena they could not explain. The very specificity of changeling characteristics, the failure to grow, the emotional disconnection, the unusual sensory responses, suggests that folklore was describing actual conditions that observers had encountered repeatedly across generations. The communities were doing what all humans do when encountering phenomena they cannot explain. They were developing explanatory frameworks that made sense within their available knowledge systems. These frameworks were wrong in their attribution of causation, but were not irrational in their attempt to understand and address genuine medical and developmental realities. The intersection of folk belief and legal authority created a complex and often tragic domain where supernatural conviction met documented criminal liability, as changeling belief persisted into historical periods where legal systems were becoming increasingly codified and documented. Courts and legal authorities were forced to confront the question of how to adjudicate cases where alleged supernatural phenomena became the basis for actions that would otherwise constitute serious crimes. The changeling myth thus left its mark not merely on folklore and family practice, but on the legal structures that governed society, creating precedent and doctrine that acknowledged supernatural belief as legitimate context for human behavior while simultaneously asserting the authority of human law over alleged supernatural interference. This collision between folk belief and legal authority produced outcomes that were often tragic for the accused and revelatory about how societies attempted to reconcile supernatural conviction with the requirements of justice. The most significant legal arena in which changeling belief manifested was that of infanticide and child mistreatment. A mother or father who harmed or killed what they believed to be a changeling was, from the perspective of legal authority, committing assault or murder against what the law recognized as a human child. Yet from the perspective of the accused, they were attempting to recover a stolen human child or to force supernatural creatures into honoring ancient bargains. This fundamental disagreement about the nature of the crime created legal scenarios where defendants could argue that they had acted without criminal intent because they genuinely believed they were interacting with supernatural beings rather than human children. Courts had to decide whether sincere belief in changeling reality constituted sufficient mitigation for what appeared to be severe violence against an infant. The legal response to changeling-based crimes evolved over time and varied across jurisdictions, but certain patterns emerged that suggested how legal systems attempted to accommodate folk belief within frameworks of criminal responsibility. Some courts accepted changeling belief as genuine context for understanding defendant motivation, effectively treating cases where parents had harmed suspected changelings differently than cases where parents had harmed genuine human children. The logic underlying such differential treatment suggested that if changelings were genuine supernatural phenomena, then parents attempting to recover stolen children or force fairy intervention were acting from legitimate parental motivation rather than malicious intent. Other courts rejected changeling belief entirely, treating it as superstition or delusion, and holding defendants fully responsible regardless of their stated convictions about supernatural replacement. The infanticide defense specifically invoked changeling belief to argue for reduced culpability in cases where women had killed infants they believed to be changelings. In several documented cases, women facing charges of infanticide successfully argued that they had killed what they genuinely believed to be changeling substitutes rather than human infants, and that under this genuine conviction, they lacked the criminal intent necessary for murder conviction. Such defenses effectively transformed infanticide law by introducing the question of maternal perception of the child's nature as potentially relevant to questions of criminal liability. If a mother genuinely believed the being in her care was a changeling, the argument ran, then she could not have intended to murder a human child, because she did not believe a human child existed to murder. The legal system thus found itself in the position of having to take seriously the possibility that supernatural beliefs, even if objectively false, could be subjectively real enough to affect questions of criminal intent and responsibility. Documentation practices in birth and baptism created another arena where changeling belief influenced legal and social systems. In many regions, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, meticulous records were maintained documenting births, baptisms, and infant deaths. These records often included specific notations about infants who had failed to grow, who had displayed unusual characteristics, or who had been the subject of community suspicion regarding changeling status. The legal and ecclesiastical authorities maintaining these records were thus acknowledging changeling belief as a legitimate phenomenon worthy of documentation. A child noted as a changeling in baptismal records would be distinguished from ordinary infants in ways that suggested changeling status was recognized as an actual category of being deserving formal documentation. Some infants were recorded with explicit notation that they were suspected changelings, creating a permanent legal record, acknowledging that communities and authorities took such suspicions seriously. The authority of the Church created an additional layer of complexity in how changeling belief was treated legally and institutionally. Priests and bishops were called upon to perform exorcisms or blessings meant to address changeling situations, actions that implicitly acknowledged changeling reality. When ecclesiastical authorities participated in rituals meant to force fairy intervention or to prove changeling status, they were lending religious authority to folk belief. Yet simultaneously, church authorities occasionally condemned the more violent interventions undertaken by communities in the name of changeling identification, recognizing that some procedures constituted unjustifiable harm, regardless of the justification offered. This created a situation where changeling belief was simultaneously endorsed and condemned by institutional authorities, suggesting fundamental uncertainty about how to treat folk belief that seemed to generate both reasonable parental concern and tragic violence. Marriage law and inheritance law occasionally intersected with changeling belief in ways that created lasting legal consequences. Questions sometimes arose about whether a child born to a marriage was legitimate if that child was later identified as a changeling. If the child had never been human, could it have been the true offspring of the married couple? These questions were not merely hypothetical, but occasionally became matters of legal contention with implications for inheritance and succession. The legal system had to determine whether changelings possessed standing to inherit property, whether marriages producing changeling children had been validly consummated, whether such children had any legal status at all. The answers that emerged varied, but the very fact that such questions received legal attention demonstrates how thoroughly changeling belief had infiltrated formal legal consciousness. The persistence of changeling belief among educated and legally trained individuals suggests that folk belief was not simply a matter of rural superstition, but rather something that penetrated multiple levels of society. Judges and lawyers, who were theoretically trained in rational thinking and scientific reasoning, sometimes acknowledged changeling belief as potentially legitimate in their legal reasoning. This persistence suggests either that changeling belief was rooted in phenomena sufficiently real that even educated observers could not entirely dismiss it, or that folk belief possessed such cultural weight that it influenced thinking even among those theoretically positioned to reject it. The legal record thus preserves evidence of the cognitive power of changeling mythology, its ability to structure perception and reasoning, even among individuals equipped with knowledge systems that should have rendered it incomprehensible. The decline of changeling belief in legal contexts roughly paralleled broader cultural transformation towards scientific medicine and away from supernatural explanation. As medical science advanced and as education became more widespread, courts became increasingly skeptical of changeling explanations for criminal behavior. By the 20th century, changeling belief rarely appeared in legal proceedings, replaced by medical and psychological explanations for the conditions that communities had once interpreted as fairy substitution. Yet the precedent had been established and the record had been created. Legal systems had once taken changeling belief seriously enough to allow it to affect judgments about criminal responsibility and the fates of accused individuals. This historical record stands as testament to the power of folk belief to shape not merely family practice, but the formal structures through which societies exercise authority and administer justice. The changeling myth did not fade into obscurity as modernity advanced, and scientific explanation displaced supernatural narrative. Instead, it transformed, adapting itself to contemporary anxieties and artistic expression, continuing to haunt cultural consciousness in forms that might not be immediately recognizable as folklore, but that carry the essential DNA of the ancient belief. In the realms of literature, film, television, and contemporary storytelling, the changeling persists as a powerful metaphorical and literal presence, functioning simultaneously as horror genre material and as profound exploration of themes that remain perpetually relevant: identity, belonging, the fragility of familial bonds, the fear that loved ones might be fundamentally altered or replaced. The myth's persistence in modern culture suggests that it articulates something true about human experience that transcends the historical moment of its origin, speaking to anxieties that appear in every era, regardless of whether supernatural explanation remains culturally plausible. Contemporary horror literature has embraced the changeling narrative with particular enthusiasm, recognizing in it a source of psychological terror that surpasses simple monster-focused narratives. Modern retellings of changeling stories emphasize the psychological horror of replacement and the epistemological uncertainty that accompanies it, the question of how one can ever be truly certain that a loved one has not been altered or replaced by something else wearing a familiar face. Authors like Charles de Lint, Kelly Armstrong, and others have developed sophisticated literary explorations of changeling themes, often blending fantasy elements with contemporary settings to create dissonance between modern expectations and ancient supernatural logic. These works translate historical, changeling terror into contemporary context, asking what it would mean for modern people to encounter situations where supernatural replacement seemed plausible, where the boundary between rational explanation and fantastic possibility remained ambiguous enough to generate genuine dread. Film and television have developed changeling narratives into complex visual and narrative explorations that often move beyond simple horror toward more nuanced examination of themes the folklore contained. Films like The Changeling have used the basic premise as foundation for psychological horror that blurs the distinction between supernatural threat and human psychological breakdown, mirroring the ambiguity that characterized historical changeling cases. Television series have developed entire narrative arcs around changeling concepts, sometimes operating within fantasy frameworks, and sometimes within apparently realistic settings, where supernatural explanation competes with psychological explanation for plausibility. These visual narratives have the capacity to create visceral identification with changeling horror in ways that literary narratives sometimes cannot. Viewers can observe the substituted being, can witness the growing estrangement between parents and the creature in their care, can viscerally experience the uncertainty about whether what appears to be happening could possibly be real. The contemporary presence of changeling mythology in fantasy literature and gaming has created an entire subgenre devoted to exploring fae abduction and substitution as genuine plot elements within fictional worlds. Entire fantasy series center on the threat of changeling substitution, developing elaborate systems of how changelings operate, what their motivations are, and what consequences their presence creates for human societies. This literary attention to changeling mechanics suggests that the basic narrative framework remains compelling enough to sustain extended fictional exploration, that audiences continue to find the scenario engaging, and that writers continue to develop new variations on ancient themes. The fantasy genre has become a space where changeling mythology can be treated as literally true within fictional frameworks, allowing exploration of the psychology and sociology of changeling existence without the constraint of needing to rationalize the phenomenon through modern scientific lens. Contemporary video games have similarly embraced changeling concepts, often employing changeling substitution as a plot revelation or as a central gameplay mechanic. Games featuring fantasy settings frequently include changelings as enemies or as plot-critical beings, translating the folklore into interactive narrative where player choices regarding changeling characters can determine story outcomes. This interactive medium creates unique opportunities for exploring the moral and ethical dimensions of changeling belief. Players must make decisions about whether to trust characters they suspect are changelings, whether to pursue interventions based on suspicion, what consequences result from incorrect or correct identification. The game medium thus creates a space where players can experience something analogous to the decision-making burden that faced historical parents confronted with suspected changelings, experiencing the uncertainty and moral weight of such situations without the real-world harm that historical interventions sometimes created. The X-Files television series, despite being science fiction rather than pure fantasy or horror, incorporated changeling-adjacent narratives into its exploration of paranormal phenomena, suggesting that contemporary audiences remained receptive to narratives involving body substitution and replacement by seemingly alien entities. Episodes featuring beings that appeared human but possessed non-human consciousness or origins drew on the basic changeling framework, translating folklore threat into science-fictional context. This translation suggested that the essential horror of changeling mythology, the fear of replacement by something wearing a familiar face, transcended the fantasy genre and could be adapted into science fiction contexts where advanced alien technology or extraterrestrial biology replace supernatural explanation for the substitution phenomenon. Modern psychological and medical horror has appropriated changeling frameworks to explore themes of identity, bodily autonomy, and psychological dissolution. Contemporary horror literature sometimes employs changeling concepts to represent conditions like dissociative identity disorder, severe mental illness, or psychological trauma, using the supernatural narrative framework as metaphor for psychological states that feel like internal substitution or replacement. A character who believes they are not in control of their own body or consciousness might be understood through changeling metaphor, the folklore providing narrative language for experiences that don't fit easily into medical or psychological categories. This appropriation of changeling metaphor for contemporary psychological phenomena suggests that the folklore continues to articulate genuine human experiences, even if the explanation for those experiences has shifted from supernatural substitution to psychological or neurological causation. The contemporary adoption of changeling mythology by LGBTQ+ creators and communities has developed new dimensions to the folklore, employing it as metaphor for coming out, identity transformation, and family estrangement resulting from perceived difference. Queer artists and writers have appropriated the changeling narrative to explore experiences of being perceived as fundamentally alien or other by family members, of families' difficulty accepting transformation or difference in beloved family members. In these recontextualizations, the changeling becomes a metaphor for anyone who appears to have fundamentally changed or revealed themselves as different from what their community expected, exploring the grief and distance that sometimes accompanies such revelation. This creative appropriation suggests that changeling mythology remains relevant precisely because it articulates experiences of profound alienation, of being misunderstood or rejected by those closest to us, of fundamental difference that cannot be reconciled or explained away. The persistence of changeling themes in contemporary music, particularly in folk and indie music contexts, demonstrates the mythology's continued capacity to generate emotional resonance and artistic expression. Musicians have created contemporary compositions exploring changeling themes, sometimes employing the folklore literally, and sometimes using it as metaphorical framework for exploring contemporary relationship dynamics and identity questions. The emotional power of these compositions suggests that audiences continue to find changeling narratives moving, that the basic themes of loss, alienation, and mysterious replacement continue to speak to contemporary experience despite living in an era when such supernatural substitution seems rationally implausible. The art created around changeling themes continues to demonstrate the mythology's value as means of articulating emotional and existential truths that might not be expressible through more straightforward narrative or discursive frameworks. Throughout this journey, we have traveled through centuries of Celtic belief, examining how an entire culture developed narrative frameworks for understanding one of the most terrifying possibilities a parent could face: the fear that the child they loved had been replaced by something fundamentally alien. We have encountered mothers and fathers driven to desperate measures by conviction that supernatural forces had stolen their children in the night. We have witnessed the collision between ancient folk belief and modern legal systems, between desperate love and the impossibility of knowing with certainty whether the being in one's care is genuinely one's own child. We have traced the mythology from its deepest roots in Celtic cosmology through its persistence into the modern era, observing how it adapted and transformed while remaining fundamentally recognizable. Now, at the culmination of this exploration, we must ask the most essential question: what does the changeling myth truly reveal about the human condition, about our deepest fears, and about the fragile foundations upon which we construct meaning and identity? The changeling is ultimately a mirror, and like all mirrors, it reflects back not the objective reality of the world, but rather the internal landscape of the observer. For Celtic communities facing inexplicable childhood illness and developmental difference, the changeling reflected their attempt to impose comprehensible narrative on medical mystery. For mothers experiencing the psychological torment of a child perceived as fundamentally other, the Changeling reflected the possibility that maternal love might be insufficient to bridge unbridgeable difference. For legal systems attempting to reconcile supernatural belief with the requirements of justice, the Changeling reflected deep uncertainty about the relationship between intention and responsibility, between genuine conviction and objective reality. Each community and each individual encountered the Changeling myth and discovered within it reflection of their own particular fears and anxieties, their own particular attempts to make sense of tragedy and incomprehensibility. The Changeling myth articulates something fundamental about parenthood: the terrifying knowledge that the being we love most is ultimately a separate consciousness, operating according to their own internal logic, potentially harboring thoughts and feelings we can never fully access or understand. A parent observing their child's development watches a transformation so dramatic and continuous that it sometimes generates the uncanny sensation that the child is becoming a stranger, that the being who entered the world is gradually being replaced by someone increasingly alien and incomprehensible. The myth acknowledges this fundamental estrangement that lies at the heart of human relationships, suggesting that perhaps the other is always somewhat changeling, always somewhat substitute for the being we imagined we were loving. This articulation of existential alienation may be the mythology's greatest psychological truth. Not that actual supernatural substitution occurs, but that all intimate relationships contain within them the potential for profound misunderstanding and the possibility that the other will reveal themselves as fundamentally different from our expectations. The Changeling myth also reflects one of the most universal human experiences: the encounter with disability, difference, and deviation from expected development. Every era, every culture encounters children and individuals who develop in unexpected ways, who display capacities and incapacities that do not match social expectations or developmental norms. The Changeling represents the attempt to provide narrative meaning for such difference to Zakasji, jest, that deviation from expected development is not mere biological variation, but rather something with cosmological significance. In doing so, the myth both acknowledges the reality of difference and provides framework for attempting to address it. The tragedy is not that the myth existed. The tragedy is that communities sometimes attempted to address the conditions it described through harm, rather than through care. Through intervention designed to prove changeling status, rather than through acceptance and adaptation to the reality of variation. The medical perspective we explored suggests that many changeling cases likely involved genuine developmental or medical conditions: failure to thrive, autism spectrum differences, genetic variation, neurological conditions that predated our ability to name or understand them medically. The Changeling myth represents communities' attempt to make sense of these phenomena, to develop explanatory frameworks when scientific explanation was unavailable. From this perspective, the myth was not false, but rather incomplete. It identified genuine phenomena, but misattributed their causation. Families observing actual medical conditions were creating narratives to explain them, and in the process, they were creating meaning from suffering, attempting to transform inexplicable tragedy into comprehensible narrative that suggested possible remedies or interventions. The horror is not that they developed the myth, but that they sometimes responded to it through actions that caused genuine harm to vulnerable children. Yet the Changeling myth also contains within it profound wisdom about the nature of belonging, acceptance, and the requirements of genuine love. Despite the potential for violence and cruelty that surrounded changeling belief, many communities and many families simply lived with their changelings, accepting them, caring for them, integrating them into family life despite initial horror and conviction of supernatural replacement. Some mothers apparently develop genuine affection for creatures they believe to be changelings, their maternal instinct and daily care eventually overcoming initial revulsion and conviction of wrongness. These responses suggest that at the deepest level, humans possess capacity for acceptance and love that transcends rationality or initial conviction, that proximity and obligation can transform our relationship to the other from rejection to embrace. The wisdom embedded in these responses may be more valuable than all the elaborate protective rituals and identification tests, the wisdom that we must learn to love what we do not fully understand, that difference is not always threat, and that our capacity for care can extend beyond the boundaries of what we can comprehend. The changeling mythology persists in contemporary culture because it continues to articulate experiences that remain universally human. We still encounter situations where loved ones seem to have changed in ways we cannot comprehend, where the person we believed we knew reveals themselves as fundamentally different or alien. We still face the challenge of accepting developmental difference and variation in our children, of adapting our expectations to reality, of loving beings who do not match the templates we had imagined for them. We still struggle with the epistemological uncertainty that accompanies intimate relationships, the fundamental impossibility of ever being entirely certain we truly know another person. The changeling myth gives voice to these experiences, provides narrative framework for these anxieties, allows us to articulate and explore fears that might otherwise remain inarticulate. As we emerge from this journey through changeling folklore, one truth becomes clear. The myth was never really about fairies at all. It was about us, about our attempts to understand the incomprehensible, to impose meaning on suffering, to maintain our sense that the world operates according to comprehensible principles, even when it refuses to do so. The changelings were never actually present, or rather, they were present in the form of children whose development did not match expectations, in the form of medical conditions we could not yet name, in the form of psychological experiences we could not yet articulate. The fair folk who performed the substitutions were never real, or rather, they were real in the sense that all metaphors are real, existing as means through which communities processed and attempted to manage the genuinely tragic and genuinely mysterious. If you have journeyed with us through this entire exploration of the changeling, through Celtic cosmology, through family desperation, through modern medical analysis, I want to thank you for investing your time and attention in understanding how ancient cultures attempted to make sense of their world. The work we do here at Echoes of the Old World is devoted to retrieving these forgotten stories, understanding the wisdom they contain, and recognizing how they continue to speak to contemporary human experience. If this narrative has resonated with you, if you find value in exploring how ancient peoples understood the mysteries of existence, please subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of those committed to preserving and understanding cultural heritage. Together, we can continue to listen to the voices of the past, learning from their wisdom while transcending their errors, honoring the depth of human experience across time and culture.